Listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the National Road Safety Partnership Program webinar, Solving Safety Problems with Language. My name is Jerome Carslake and I'm just waiting for the slide to come across. There we go. So my name is Jerome Carslake and I manage the National Road Safety Partnership Program and its many activities. To find out more about the program, please check out the NRSPP website and register for the newsletter. So today's session will go for approximately 60 minutes with plenty of time for discussion. We'll be recording the session today and it will be shared on the NRSPP website, and the PowerPoint slides you'll be able to find as well there. So if you miss anything, you can always come back and revisit it. What we're going to be having is we really do like a nice interactive session, as with all our webinars. This is the opportunity to sit there and you can type in as many questions as you want and we'll filter them through to our speakers as we go through. So let's now move on to finding out who we have joining us today. Our presenter today is Brett Rutledge. Welcome to you, Brett.
G'day, Jerome. How are you?
Awesome, mate. So it's great to have you in the studio. Now, for those of you who don't know about Brett, Brett is a former world champion of public speaking and an internationally regarded business strategist, linguist, and communication expert. He's acted as a key advisor, working with many high-profile individuals and organizations. So let's dive on in and get started in it, shall we?
Absolutely. So today we're talking about solving safety problems with language, and that's not a usual approach. We're business linguists. What we do is we study language and its impact on various different things that have to do with business. And the key thing to understand about language is that language is identity. It's one and the same thing. So words not only allow us to express what we think, but they also shape how we think. And they do that in quite surprising ways. There's been a theory in linguistics for a long time that there are certain constructs that remain consistent no matter what language you're speaking. And this is in fact what Noam Chomsky is famous for. He's a well-known linguist. Many of you would have heard of him. And he was famous for coming up with this theory that there are certain constructs that always appear in language. Unfortunately for Noam, brilliant man that he is, he's wrong. What we found in recent years, and you've got to bear in mind that linguistics as a study is really only about 80 years old. It's only in the 1930s that we started looking at language seriously and the impact that it has. And what we've discovered over recent years is there's no such thing as a universal meaning in language. It just doesn't exist. So for example, words like yes and no. Now you would think there'd be a word for yes and a word for no in every language.
I thought it'd be quite obvious, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not the case. In Gaelic languages, for example, Celtic languages, so what we're talking here is Welsh, Scottish, Irish, those kinds of languages. So these are not obscure languages, right? These are quite well known. There is no direct translation for yes or no. It does not exist.
Does that make it harder to manage them?
It might do, but what you'll find is, if anyone out there who's got Irish grandparents, for example, what you'll discover is, because it crosses over into when they're speaking English, is they won't tend to say yes or no. They'll say things like, did you go out for a drink last night, Murphy? I did, Patrick. Right? They'll say that I did or I did not. I did go out for a drink. I didn't go out for a drink. So something as fundamental as yes or no is not necessarily found across every language. Left and right. Basic concept of left and right. Again, not found in every language. In fact, here in Australia, there are languages that do not have a left or a right. In particular, Aboriginal languages in Queensland and another group up in WA and out towards Cape York, they don't have a concept for left or right. They don't think of the world that way. What they do is instead they describe everything using cardinal directions. So it's north, south, east, west. All right.
So what does that mean for our road signs then? If you come over from those countries and there's a sign that says keep left.
Well, it's not that they can't figure that out. And this is one of the things. We used to think that what language would do is it controlled your thinking completely. So if you didn't have a word for something, then you couldn't understand the concept. Now, that's not true. And it doesn't take much to figure out that it's not true. You can think of lots and lots of things where you don't necessarily understand all the words or have all the words, but you still generally understand the concept, or you can have it explained to you. But what it does do is it makes you focus on certain things. So what language does is it doesn't stop you from understanding things, or it doesn't limit your thinking in any way, but it does mean that you habitually focus in on certain things. So in that example that I was talking about with our Aboriginal friends further north, what happens with them is that those of us who speak English as a first language, in fact, those of us who speak most languages around the world, because they're quite egocentric languages, in other words, we're always the focus, right? It's always about me. So it's always to the left of me, to the right of me, behind me, in front of me. I'm the center of the universe. Because they don't have left or right, they don't think that way. They think in terms of the landscape orienting them. So they will think in terms of what's around them in the landscape, and they learn that from a very early age. So if I get a group of English speakers in a room and tell them all to shut their eyes and point east, I'll have as many hands and fingers pointing as many directions as I have people, right? They'll have no idea where east is. Yet if I get a group of these Aboriginal people who are 5 years old, for example, they will know exactly where east is because they grow up knowing that. They're like their own GPS unit. So we don't have a good grip on direction, north, south, east, west, because typically we don't get taught to think or talk that way. We talk in terms of left, right, and so on. So you'll notice that whenever we're giving directions for any kind of short distance, we will tend to do it in terms of how it relates to you. Go straight up this road, go directly ahead of you, then turn to your right. You know what I mean? Yep, we could just as easily say go north, then turn east, but we don't do that. We only do that when we're talking about longer distances. And that's because our language conditions us to do that. It's that fundamental. And it's very, very hard to break, very hard to get away from.
So what happens about people when you've actually got multiple, when you're bilingual?
Well, bilingual is really, really interesting because there's this idea that everyone has in their head that bilingual people are equally fluent in both languages. Now, that's quite rare. That's not usually the case. Normally what happens with bilingual people is you're very proficient in whatever your base language is, and by working really hard, you can get by in another language. It does have some interesting implications, and this is very recent research that's only just come out in the last couple of years. We were looking at decision-making with people who speak more than one language, because the idea was that we thought, well, if you've got to work really hard in, to speak a different language, then that may well affect your decision-making capacity because you don't have a lot of room left over to process things. Your brain's working so hard just trying to get this language right. What we discovered was that it does affect your decision-making, but not in the way we thought. It doesn't make it worse. It actually makes it better. What happens is that in your base language, you have a very strong emotional connection to things. So all the words that you use, if you're a natural English speaker, which I imagine most of the people listening in are, you will be quite emotional about English words and phrasing and structure because you've grown up with it and everything is connected to you through that language. Once you start speaking another language, that emotional connection typically isn't there. So what we discover is that people will make more rational decisions in a second language than they will in their first language. So for example, if I got a group of people together and I said, here's $100, you get to keep that, or you can gamble it or flip a coin, heads or tails. If you win that toss, I'll give you $250 instead of $100. Now, most of us in a natural language won't take that bet. At least half of us will go, oh, it's a bit risky. I'd rather just hang on to what I've got. As soon as we switch to a second language, 3/4 of us will take that bet. It jumps up that much. And that's because we recognize that's a good bet. If I'm getting more than double my money and I've got a 50-50 chance and I didn't have the money in the first place, that's a really good bet. What am I worried about? Let's roll the dice and see what happens. But in our natural English-speaking language or any other language, we're less inclined to do that because human beings are risk-adverse by nature. And the language encompasses that. It's only when we step outside of our natural language that all of a sudden that decision-making framework changes. So the point that we're making here is that nothing is universal in language. If there's not a word for yes or no in every language, if there's not a word for left or right in every language, and it goes beyond that as well. There are some languages out there, for example, that don't have colors. They don't exist. In Papua New Guinea, there are some tribes that that use color as a metaphor. So they won't talk about red, blue, green, or whatever. They will talk about a red parrot or a blue, lizard or something like that, and they'll use that metaphor to get across the idea that there are different colors because they don't have words for colors themselves. Interestingly, when there are colors, even those languages that have limited colors, in English, by the way, we have about 11 as stock standard in the English language. Those of you who are involved in design and things like that, you'll have a lot more at your disposal, but most of us deal in about 11 colors in English, even though the eye can perceive a lot more. And typically what happens in languages around the world where colors are used is that there'll always be a word for black and white, and the next one will always be red. Always. And the reason for that, we think, is that red is the color of blood. So it's fairly important. If you see red, then chances are something is fairly seriously wrong, and you need to be able to react to that and recognize that. It's interesting that the word red, for example, in Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit, which is where a lot of our language comes from, is the same as the word for blood. It's exactly the same. So that shows you how strong a connection there is. So even colors don't necessarily exist in every language.
So I'm just got a question came through here from Ian saying, is there any research that supports the concept that people will be more inclined to take a bet in a different language?
Yes, there is. Yeah, there's quite a bit of it. Now, I can't remember it right off the top of my head, but there was quite a large study done, and they did it for Ian's benefit. They did it in multiple languages. So they got a group of people who not only spoke English, but they also spoke in different combinations, Spanish, German, French, and a couple of others. So they were able to mix and match all of these different combinations, and they could see quite a distinct difference in their decision making. You are undoubtedly more rational when you speak in a second language, which is an interesting concept for things like multinational negotiations. Brexit, for example, where they're busy in the UK negotiating with the French and the Germans and the Spanish and God knows how many others to get out of Brexit. They might arrive at a better decision if they were all forced to negotiate in the other people's languages.
And what about the little nuances in that as well? So I guess obviously you have English, you have different forms of English. There's Australian, and there's the English, as we had our Irish, and there's a racist flag tagged earlier about being the Irish drinker by Mark. But then how does it does that impact it as well?
Yes, well, you get different dialects. In the United States, for example, and we don't tend to think of the United States as having different dialects, but there are at least 26 different dialects in the United States, some of which you'll recognize as soon as we start saying them. The New York dialect, for example, the Boston dialect, quite different ways of talking. Texas gets different again. So there are always different dialects. There are different ways that words are used. There are different phrases. You get into the UK, of course, you've got God knows how many different dialects there. And some of the most famous are Cockney, things like Cockney rhyming slang, where you take two words that are unrelated to the concept you're talking about, but they rhyme with the word you want to use. So you go up the apple and pears, which means the stairs, that kind of thing. So there's lots and lots of different ways that language gets used. One of the interesting things about English is that there's so much that's left out in English. There's so much that we don't bother to say that we would be required to say in other languages. So, for example, if you say something like, yesterday I went to my neighbour's for some food, right? Now, we all understand roughly what that means because we all speak English here. But if you think about what you don't know the gender of anyone involved. If we were speaking French, you would automatically know who was male, who was female, and so on, because that's built into their language. You don't know the distance I traveled. You don't know whether I went just next door to a neighbor or whether I went 5 miles down the road to a neighbor. So you don't really know what I consider a neighbor to be and whether that matches up with your definition. You don't know if I had a meal or if I had a snack. You don't know what food means. There's so much that we don't bother to communicate. And this is kind of where all of the problems begin and end. And it's a really important concept to understand, this idea that nothing is universal in language, because that has fairly important implications for everything else. What it means is that literally every single word you use is contextual. There's no universal meaning for anything. There's no universal meaning for something like safety or food or neighbor or any of the other examples I use. They all get defined by me. And if I don't take the time to explain my context to you, then what you're going to do is you're going to arrive with yours. And now we're in trouble. So let me give you a very practical example from the business world. If you ask someone what they do, what you'll find is they don't tell you what they do, they tell you what it's called, as if that's the same thing. So for example, you say to someone, what do you do? I'm an accountant. Oh, like Bernie Madoff in New York, who ripped off all those people to the tune of 300 million or whatever it was. And they go, no, not like that. And I go, oh, good on you. You haven't been caught yet. And the point is that they didn't bother to tell me what they meant by accountant. So I've come in with my own interpretation. Now, Bernie Madoff in New York is an accountant. That was his profession. So I'm perfectly entitled to say that and think that way. And now the whole conversation is about that accountant trying to prove that I'm wrong. Good luck with that, because that's not happening. It's already in my head. I'm already thinking that way. And there are so many conversations that we have where someone has a particular meaning for one word, someone else interprets it differently because we've never bothered to explain what we meant by that word, and now there's an argument going on. And no one actually realizes what they're arguing about, which is the meaning of the word. They think they're actually arguing about the concept itself. And if you think in politics, for example, in the United States, on both sides of the fence, Democrats and Republicans believe in freedom, but they have different definitions of what they mean by freedom. For the Democrats, it tends to be freedom of choice. For the Republicans, it tends to be more of an economic freedom. And then they're constantly accusing each other of curtailing the other's freedoms. So you get lots and lots of issues that bubble away because no one's actually bothered to define what they mean by their context in the first place.
I guess with the younger generation coming along, social media, those sort of things as well, what sort of impacts is that having on sort of communications with regards to how do you engage the younger workforce? Because that must be making life even more complex for an organisation as well.
Yeah, it does. There's a couple of things. In the English language alone, for example, we add about 4,000 words to the language every year, which is a bit scary. You know, so recent additions in the last couple of years include words like twerk. All right, now twerking prior to Miley Cyrus and whoever else made it popular didn't really exist. It's not a word. It's a word now. There have been lots of additions like that. So every year there are about 4,000 words that are being added to the English language. So the English language is growing ever more complex and ever more complicated. And what that means, of course, is that you're going to regularly encounter between the generations terms that are being used that you fundamentally don't understand because you've never heard them before. And this is where you get the arguments of people going, well, that's not English. You know, you're not using proper English. You're not. The reality is language evolves. So as much as you may not like it, I'm afraid that twerk is here to stay. It is proper English. That's life. And this is one of the things about English that's incredibly powerful. It's the reason that it is easily the most dominant language in the world by quite some distance. 80% of the internet is English. 80%. And that's largely because most of the coding is also English. Java, for example, all done in English.
Are we seeing the same sort of evolutions in other languages as well?
We do, to a lesser extent. And what's happening in the world is that a lot of these other languages are becoming less and less influential. Chinese, for example, Mandarin, most people think of as being, you know, one of the most influential languages in the world. It actually sits at about 5th. So it's behind French. It's behind Spanish. And the reason for that is because while many people speak Mandarin, it's all basically restricted to one geographical location. You know, it doesn't spread out beyond that. It sits in a very specific part of Asia. And a lot of those people have English as a second language anyway. In fact, 20% of the population globally have English as either a first or a second language. And English is this, in the linguistics world, English is this behemoth that sort of mugs other languages in dark alleys and then rifles through their pockets for spare vocabulary and grammar and just steals it. If we don't have a word for something, we'll take yours. Thanks very much. Think of all the words that in English that come from other languages. Restaurant.
And does it make it harder then for international organisations, especially with regards to when they, I guess, introduce a policy or something like that? How do they mix and match?
Yeah, it makes it very difficult because, again, you have to take the time to explain your context, and you have to explain it in terms of a context that people already understand. Trying to teach them a new one is quite difficult. You and I were talking before we came on air about braking distances and mass and so on. Mass is a very scientific term. Most people don't really understand what mass is or how it works. If you want people to understand the difference in braking distance depending on the weight of your vehicle, the mass of your vehicle, then you either need to literally take them out on a road so they can physically experience it, or you need to give them something they can do themselves that demonstrates the same thing. So, for example, if you walk and stop, just count down 3, 2, 1 and just stop yourself, you'll find that you stop quite easily. If you sprint as fast as you can and then try to stop, you can't stop anywhere near as quickly. And that's the idea of momentum and mass and those kinds of things being translated into a very human experience. And the more that you can reduce things to the human level, the better off you are. Statistics generally don't cut it, by the way. We don't process those very well.
Being a scientist in a research organisation, that's probably one of the depths we fall into quite often.
Yeah, unless you reduce it to, again, a single human kind of context. So an example of that are people like World Vision, who encourage you to sponsor a child. Now, that's not what they're doing. That's not the way the world works, right? World Vision don't walk into a village somewhere in Africa and say to one child, congratulations, you get water this week because you've been sponsored, and say to the next child, bad luck, maybe next week we'll have something for you. The reason that they get you thinking about one child that you're sponsoring is because you can identify with that. You can connect with that.
That emotional link.
Yeah, if you say to people, look, here's a whole village that are starving, we'll sit there go, or a whole country, we'll go, well, that's terrible, but what can I do? I'm just one person. Whereas if we show you a single child and say, here's a child that's starving, then the response is more, well, how can I not help? How can I not be involved? It's only one. So that's why they do it. As much as you can, you reduce things down to a human level. So the point that we're making is that if every single word is contextual, then you need to stop when you're developing your safety policies and your processes and everything else. You need to just stop and look at every single word and what it actually means. So if we take a word like safety, generally speaking, the broad meaning is the condition of being protected from or unlikely to cause danger, risk, or injury. So there's a lot of connecting words in there. We don't need those. Let's take those out and see what actually matters here. So it's to protect from danger, risk, and injury. Now, if you haven't taken the time to define what danger means, what risk means, what injury means in your particular workplace, in your particular circumstances, then your safety policies and procedures and processes are already failing before you even start. And this is what we mean about everything being contextual. Danger, risk, and injury will be different for every single workplace, either subtly or dramatically. The idea of what protecting people from these things means will also be vastly different. So you have to take the time to understand what is meant by these terms and get it right. And we always say with language, one of the problems that people have is they have this vague idea of what something means, but they've never really done their homework to find out what it means or to take the time to think it through. And as a consequence, they tend to use words that have very loose definitions that they've never really thought through. And they're relying on the other person to have the same kind of loose definition that they do and somehow arrive at the same decision. So I'll give you a very, very practical example. You say to someone, I need this report by Wednesday. Okay? Now, technically, Wednesday starts at 12 a.m. and it goes all the way through to 11:59 p.m. Now, the reality is it's highly unlikely that you are happy to have this report delivered to you at 10:30 p.m. at night.
I'd like a COB. How about COB on Wednesday?
Close of business. So you're using some jargon.
Why not?
Right? So again, we've got now the added complication. Do people know what close of or COB means? Do they know it means close of business? But now you mean close of business where you are. Close of business for you. That's not necessarily the same as close of business for someone else. It depends on whether or not they think of close of business as when the business closes, or they think of it as when they finish work. Now, if you've got a part-time worker who knocks off at 12:30, around lunchtime, for example, then they may think, though, I've got to get this done by 12:30 and put unnecessary pressure on themselves. If you've got someone who works all the way through to 7 o'clock at night, they may think that they've got till 7 o'clock at night. And this is what we mean about these terms, that they tend to be quite vague in a lot of ways. And even the most simple words that we think we've got a handle on, what you'll find more often than not is we really don't. We haven't thought it through.
Well, what about like a policy if you say zero drug and alcohol tolerance? That's our organisation byline.
So again, I know this sounds pedantic and silly, but what's a drug?
Mm-hmm.
What do we consider alcohol? Do we literally mean zero tolerance? In other words, absolutely none whatsoever of any description. If you're talking about drugs, for example, are you only talking about class A, class B type drugs, or are you talking about caffeine, which is a drug? Are we banning coffee? Is coffee gone? Is tea gone? Incidentally, same amount of caffeine in tea as there is in coffee. You're not doing yourself any favors. So, if you don't take the time to figure out what this stuff means, what you're doing is you're applying a label that someone else will try and interpret as best they can, and quite often get wrong in terms of what you meant by it. And what we find as linguists when we go in and work with companies is that usually what happens is that no one's actually thought through what they meant by the term in the first place. So it's not until they run into a problem or some kind of argument that they start to define or refine their thinking in the first place. So when you're going through this stuff, what you've got to realize is that because there's no universal words or meanings in language, then there are no universal safety messages either. You cannot simply go out there and talk about zero tolerance and assume that everyone knows what that means, because chances are you don't even really know what it means.
What about shared responsibility?
Well, again, shared responsibility relies on shared meaning.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't have the same understanding of something, then how can we have shared responsibility? It doesn't work. You have to take the time to figure out what these things actually mean. If we're saying no to drugs, then we have to define what we mean by drugs, and we have to make sure that everyone understands that. Because what will happen is that if people find one exception to your rule, then the whole rule is destroyed.
Australians, of course, never like that, do we?
No. So it's so important that people understand that everything is contextual and you have to work within your own space. Even the idea of just borrowing other people's campaigns or language or practices or policies is not a good idea, because your situation will be quite different. So no universal safety messages. This is the other thing that happens. As much as we don't take the time to define a word at the front end, like safety, we haven't fully understood what we meant by that, and therefore we're not communicating it very well. The other thing that we tend to do is we use words inappropriately. We use words to mean things that don't really mean what we're trying to get them to mean. And we're going to pick on a really common one here, which is accident. So broadly speaking, an accident is an unfortunate incident that happens unexpectedly and unintentionally, typically resulting in damage or injury. Now, again, let's break this down a little bit. Typically resulting in damage or injury doesn't matter, because that means there are exceptions to that. All right? If it says typically, then it means that that's not always the case. So forget that. Take that out. Then let's take out the other words that are just joining things up here and see what really matters. And what you get with an accident is it has to be unfortunate, it has to be unexpected, it has to be unintentional.
Well, Peter makes the comment here, an act of God.
Well, an act of God, yeah, which is the classic definition of an accident, as all insurance companies know and actively embrace. It's amazing how religious insurance companies are. So for it to be unfortunate, unexpected, and unintentional, if you think about what are often described as accidents, most of them aren't accidents. For example, if you run a red light, that's intentional. If you see the red light coming, you think, no, I'll just sneak through here, I'm going to put my foot down and just go through, and then you have some sort of crash as a result of that. Well, that's no longer an accident, because you intentionally ran that light. If I'm drunk and I get into a car and then I crashed the car. Now, I may not have intended to crash the car, but it's hardly a surprise, is it? You know, we know that my judgment will be impaired, so do I, and yet I've gone in. So it's not unexpected. So when you start to look at those kinds of things, the interesting thing about the word accident is what it does is it absolves people of responsibility. See, if it's a genuine accident, if it was unexpected, unintentional, you couldn't stop it, right? There's nothing you could do to stop it. It's only in hindsight that you might think of a few things that might help down the track. So genuine accidents you can't stop. So if you've got a safety program that's focused on preventing accidents, why? Because a genuine accident can't be prevented. And this is where it comes back to safety and what it really is. If you're focused on preventing injury, if you're focused on minimizing risk, if you're focused on eliminating danger, all good, because these are real concrete things. But this idea of an accident is one of the most damaging things in the safety world. And it's a bit of a euphemism in a way. We'll call it an accident because then we can all pretend that it wasn't anyone's fault. Which doesn't work terribly well, by the way, because English is a language that's very blame-driven. Again, egocentric language. One of the things that's interesting about English is that if we witness a car crash, a French-speaking person will be able to tell you what happened and the sequence in which the events played out. English-speaking people aren't very good at that, but we'll know whose fault it was. We'll nail that in a nanosecond for you. No problem at all. So even the words that we use to describe things, and one of the things that Jerome, we've been working with you on a road suicide project and research project, and one of the interesting things about that is that when we label something as an accident, when we label something as an accidental death, do we take away some of the seriousness of it? If for example, if someone commits suicide, and there's a piece of language in itself which has got a problem, the fact that I naturally went commit suicide. Yep. See, I'm apportioning blame. I can't help myself because I'm an English speaker. You don't talk about committing a heart attack.
No, and that's one of those key points that really came out when we did that sort of workshop, was that language is key into how you consider the other sort of parties. Exactly, and was death by suicide.
Yes, and suicide is a form of death, as a heart attack is. Now, people will argue that suicide is intentional and therefore it's different. But then again, for many people, a heart attack is also intentional because you abuse your body over a long period of time. It just takes a lot longer. So, when you start examining the language that's used to describe things and explain things, you suddenly realize there's all sorts of biases hidden in that. There are all sorts of problems, and that we haven't taken the time again to explain what we really mean. So there's a key point in amongst all of this. If you don't know how to say something, it's because you don't know what you're talking about.
Ian's just raised a question here. Mm-hmm. What do you think of the message zero harm?
That always comes up. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of zero harm at all. And the reason for that is because zero harm is unattainable. And I only look at this as a linguist, so I'm looking at the language. Harm in its broadest definition is anything adverse. Right? You cannot eliminate adversity from the workplace. So it's not possible, right? It cannot be done. So those people who would sit there and go, oh, well, we're just pushing ourselves, we're aiming for something that's really hard to attain. You're not. You're actually aiming for something that's not attainable at all, which means that your own people won't be able to relate to it. They won't be able to accept it. There's a world of difference between saying we're aiming for zero injuries versus aiming for zero harm. Zero harm is just not remotely achievable. And one of the things that we know is when you set goals that aren't remotely achievable, they're demotivating. They don't inspire people to lift themselves up to another level. Everyone looks at it and goes, well, there's no way we can get there, so we might as well give up now. So zero harm is something that should be eliminated from the lexicon.
Okay. And a question here from Carol, and she sort of puts forward going, look, disagree with the cause and effect sources, assuming maliciousness and looking for blame with hindsight has been part of the issue for years. Blame is part of the current issue we challenge as it stops learning. This is what systems thinking is built on.
Yes, I'm not quite sure what the question is, but
more of a statement. I think we'd like to comment.
Yeah, the issue is that English language is inherently got blame built into it. We can't help ourselves. This is what we do. So you have to make a conscious choice to eliminate blame. And you're right. Trying to seek blame all the time is a problem, because you're immediately trying to find someone that you can hold responsible for something happening rather than trying to prevent things from occurring in the future. The model probably that is worth following is the air accident investigation people in the United States, or anywhere around the world really, who go in and they try to figure out, why did this plane go down? They're not looking to attach blame. It's not the point, because this crash has already happened. They want to make sure that there's nothing here that's going to cause another plane to go down in the future. So, but what we tend to do is we tend to go in looking for people to blame. And that's, again, it's built into the language. It's something that we do naturally. It's interesting, in the French justice system, they have a magistrate whose job it is to go in after the police and just try to figure out what happened. Not apportion blame at all. That's not their job. They're just literally there to collate the facts and let everyone know what occurred. That's probably something worth looking at.
That's because I remember talking to the Flight Safety Foundation, it's just culture. What's your thoughts around that sort of, in describing that sort of approach?
Well, again, the issue is that, as we said at the start, language is identity. So when you're talking culture, the language is bound up in that. And we do have a tendency to use labels, to use words as if they have universal meanings, when, as we've just discussed, they don't. So let me give you a little example, as a really simple example. If I ask you a series of questions, Jerome, and you just throw the answers back at me, really simple, easy, not going to press you too much. So what's your name?
Jerome.
Okay, and where do you live?
Malvern East.
Okay, and how old are you?
43.
And what's 12 times 10?
120.
And what's 12 times 18?
Now you're pushing.
And this is the point, right? The reason that you struggle you could come out with answers really, really easily because you knew the answers. As soon as we arrived at something you didn't know, it was a real struggle to get an answer out. Now, what happens is
back in high school, I did.
Yeah, what happens is some people are really good at covering that up. So some people will start just babbling, and they'll say, well, 12 times 10 was 120, therefore we're looking at, 6 times 10 more than, or 6 times 12 more than that, so
talk through the
72.
answer.
Exactly. But it's still the same issue. They don't know what they're talking about, and they're just buying time. So whenever you find something that you can't articulate properly, that you can't get a message across, it is literally because you don't know what you're talking about.
I've got some interesting ones which come through from Nikki, talking about how one of the states have a zero strategy focus on no road deaths and serious injuries. That going along the line, saying collectively, everything in their power should be to push the number of deaths on WA's roads towards zero. Should they be more specific and alter their language to focus on zero incidents?
Well, it's always a good idea to be more specific. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. Specificity is a very, very good idea because, again, what's a major injury? Does that mean minor injuries are okay? Are we trying to eliminate collisions between cars? We don't know what this thing is that's causing the deaths or causing the injuries. And until you work way backwards and start categorizing those, because not all of those things are in your influence, right? Some of them you can influence, some of them you can't. So one of the issues that we have when we have these big, vague kind of catch-all terms and targets is that you're going to really struggle to achieve it because you haven't broken down what are the areas that you can actually influence and what you can't. If you were talking about, for example, it's interesting. When you're driving along the road, you always see those signs that telling you drowsy drivers die and things like that. No, they don't. Sleeping drivers die.
I've fallen asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, you actually have to fall asleep first. It's not about being tired necessarily. We're looking at a precursor. And because we haven't actually taken the time to work out what this sequence is and what we can really influence and what we can't, if it said something like feeling tired, pull over now, have a rest, or again, it's about being specific as much as you can. These broad targets are often just a way of looking like you're doing something without actually doing much at all.
So how hard is it for some organizations, because if you begin going to different demographics, like the young male drivers, one of the high risk sort of groups on the road. One of the things that people get told quite often is a lot of the campaigns, they believe it just won't happen to them. That's the issue. Like, I'm bulletproof, life will go on. How do you sort of reach into that sort of group if they're sort of working in your organisation?
So again, you have to find a context they already understand. Now you see this with some ads that are quite effective. There have been some ads been run by, I think, WorkSafe of late, where they haven't focused on the person that's being injured. They've focused on their family. The idea that you need to go home, so your family are there waiting for you. They're relying on you. There's this idea that if I fundamentally don't care about myself, or I don't think that something can happen to me, you can't convince me otherwise. You're wasting your time. You have to find another way in. You have to find another thing that I care about so that I can connect with that instead. So in this case, what WorkSafe are doing is they're saying, all right, so we've got these guys who don't care about themselves so much, but they might care about their workmates. They might care about their family at home. So we'll go in from that angle instead, and hopefully that will connect with them. And that's the idea. You have to find a context that people already understand and use that to get your message across, not try and teach them a brand new one, because that is a very hard road to hoe. It's like we were saying before with the accountant example. You know, you're trying to convince me I'm wrong. It's not going to happen. Certainly not in a hurry. In fact, generally the only way it will happen is if something happens to me that proves I'm wrong. You know, so if I am physically injured, if I am involved in a crash or something like that, you telling me about it will never work. And a lot of these shock ads that get used are not very effective for the same reason, because it puts you in the position of being the closest spectator. So you're sitting there going, oh, well, that's terrible, but that wouldn't happen to me, because it hasn't happened to me. When you're required to use your imagination, that's different, because all of a sudden you have to think through it yourself, in which case it is happening to you on some level. So there's a very effective, if you want to have a look, there's a very effective ad, a seatbelt safety ad that was done in the UK. I think it was the Sussex county. Just go to YouTube and look for Sussex seatbelt ad. We'll circulate an effective ad. Yeah,
we'll circulate as part of this.
And there's no words, pretty much. Well, there's no spoken words. There's no cars. There's nothing to do with roads or anything else, but it makes its point very effectively, particularly if you've got a family.
So how would someone, if you're a middle management and you're understanding the risk and you know what's happening at the coalface, how do you push up?
Look, one of the problems with safety, and you're just saying, you know, if there's no universal safety message, then there's no universal safety practice either. All of these things have to be developed in-house. And one of the biggest problems with safety is this idea it can be done in isolation. Safety doesn't work that way. Safety has to be something that's done right across the organization. If you've got someone in charge of safety who sits at a mid-level, you've already got a problem, because that already says, well, we've compartmentalized this, we've just tucked it away. If you've got companies that think of safety as a compliance issue, you've got a problem. Safety and compliance are not the same thing. Compliance is actually a French word, complir. It basically means to fill up, to complete something, to finish something. So you think about that, right? That's the compliance mindset. I've ticked the box. I'm done. I'm finished. That's not a safety mindset. Safety's never finished. Safety's never done. It's always changing. So you have to have, as a company, you have to have a company-wide mindset around safety. In a way, for big corporates, right, you imagine a mining company, right? You can't just be a marketing manager. You should be a marketing and safety manager. You shouldn't be an HR manager. You should be an HR and safety manager. It should always be there.
It should be entrenched.
Yes, because it's vital. And we always say, if you want to change behavior, the fastest way to do it is change the language. If you surround people with safety language and you're constantly hammering what that means and how it works, and they're getting to experience it, then you have to sort of toe the line. You have to start living that way, or you leave because it becomes intolerable. So again, you know, one of the best examples of how language was used to change behavior was with the word dwarf. We don't call people dwarves anymore. You know, we call them little people. And that was the reason for that was because dwarves recognized that the word dwarf implied they were a different species, implied that they were, you know, something totally different to a human being. They wanted the word people in there to say, well, they're just like everyone else, we're just smaller. hence the term little people, and that's commonly used now. What's really interesting is if you follow the etymology, if you go back to where dwarf comes from, it's Nordic. It's actually Norse mythology, and it was a little creature that had one thing, one distinguishing characteristic about it. It was invisible. So the idea of the word dwarf comes from this idea, I can't see you. Now you begin to understand why it was offensive. And that attitude carries through no matter what, all the way through. And now in changing the language, we now look at them very differently. We think of them differently. We think of them as being people who are capable of doing anything else that a taller person is capable of. That's the impact language can have, in very, very simplistic terms, I know, but it's how important it is.
And Nars asked a question here. How about the use of humour as a medium for safety communications? How does that fit in?
All right, so the problem you're going to have, Nars, is that humour is very subjective. And there are a couple of issues here. If you want people to take something seriously, then you need to be serious because they're taking their cues off you. So when you use humour, you sometimes take away the seriousness of it. It becomes a bit of a joking matter. It becomes something that isn't as vital as it perhaps should be treated. The other problem you're going to have is that not everyone finds the same stuff funny, right? If you look at comedians, for example, like Dave Hughes, there are people out there who absolutely love Hughesy, and there are other people who think he's god-awful. And this is always the problem you're going to have with humour. So we'd be very, very careful about how humour is used. And you want to make sure that if you're going to use humour, that is a context that everyone understands and accepts and finds amusing. And it's also got to serve a purpose. If you're just doing it because it makes it easier to talk about something, that's not necessarily such a great idea.
You can also be opening a whole new Pandora's box for other issues.
Yeah.
One last question before Sharon asks a question here. What are the key words you believe would capture a person's attention and reflect on their behaviour with regards to operating a vehicle in a manner that may reduce the risk of a crash?
All right. So again, everything is contextual. There's no universal safety message. There's no universal safety practice. There's no universal safety standard. It just doesn't exist. You have to look at what works inside your own company or your own organization. That being said, if you want to get people's attention, generally speaking, the way you get people's attention is you surprise them. That's how it works around the world. Think about every infomercial you've ever seen. That's the technique they use. I'll show you a photo of here's Bob, 6 months ago, 300 pounds. And then they'll show you an after shot. Here's Bob today, 180 pounds soaking wet. And the contrast is such a surprise that grabs your attention. If you want to keep people's attention, though, you don't keep surprising them because it's like a drug. You've got to give a bigger and bigger shot to get the same effect. What you do is you create curiosity. And the way that you do that, the best way to do that is to do what's called creating an information gap. So in other words, if you can find something that they think they know about, or they think they know the answer to, and show them that they don't, the brain is just conditioned to want to try and fill that gap. It can't help itself. So that's how you get them hooked, if you like. And again, infomercials do this with things like the price. They ask you, how much would you expect to pay? And they give you a couple of examples, and then they head off in some other direction. And you're sitting there going, no, I need to know how much. Even if you have no intention of buying it, you need to know how much. So those kinds of language tricks, those linguistic tricks, can be very effective, but you have to do it in such a way that's relevant to your particular circumstances. Unfortunately, as we keep saying, there's no silver bullet here. It doesn't exist. We have to figure out what's the language that's relevant to your particular organization and your particular people.
So that's probably where the key thing about having the right, being armed with questions, would that be a great way? So when you're actually engaging with people, getting them to engage in discussion around it?
Well, again, not necessarily, because if you think about the infomercial example,
yep,
that's not the way they do it. Because for a question to work, you've got to be interested in the subject in the first place. Okay. Right? If you're not interested in the subject, then that question is not going to grab you. So again, it's about showing them something that they would have thought was everywhere, and you're showing them, well, in actual fact, it's not. Like we did at the beginning of this, when we talk about, Gaelic languages don't have a word for yes or no. Now, is that particularly useful in a safety context? No. Does it get your attention, though? Yes, because you would have thought every language in the world has a yes or no. And that's the kind of thing you're talking about. You're finding that thing where people go, oh, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that. How does that work? We often talk about what are the most common words in the English language. Yeah, and most people will go, oh, it's probably the, and, It's not. It's you and I.
Straight away went for the and.
Yeah, exactly. We think of all the joining words, but easily, and this is how egocentric English is, right? The most common words are you and I. And all of a sudden, that also gives you an indication of how we communicate, how important that personal connection is. If you and I are the most common words, that tells you a lot about how we communicate with each other. And unfortunately, what a lot of organizations do when it comes to safety and those kinds of practices is they eliminate you and I. And they start using things like passive tense. They use the, it, and then they wonder why there's no connection. So a lot of the time, unfortunately, a lot of what you're saying, if you step back objectively and you look at it as a linguist, you'll realize that a lot of what you're saying doesn't make sense. And even some of the comments that have come through here today, you look at your language, you go, what are you trying to say? There's got to be a simpler way of asking what you've just asked. Why didn't you do it that way? So a lot of the times we're using language as a barrier. We're using it to try and make ourselves sound smarter, more sophisticated, using it as an authority thing. We're using long words because I'm the head of safety or something like that. Therefore, I've got to look really smart and intelligent. So I'm going to use this big, long $5 word when I could have used this 50-cent word and cut through a lot quicker. So there's a huge amount of bias sitting in our language. And it's interesting, artificial intelligence, for example, huge amount of bias in bots, chat bots and things like that, artificial intelligence, because the programmers are programming in a language and all of their biases in that language are coming through. And the more we learn about artificial intelligence, the more we realize language is absolutely the key to it. And we're a long way from mastering it. For all of those guys out there telling you that, we're just about to the point where we can converse with robots and not tell the difference between them and a person. No, we're not. We are a long, long way away. So one of the things that we're trying to get people to understand is that safety is how you protect your people from danger, risk, or injury. You have to decide what that means. You have to decide what the danger is, what the risk is, what the injury is. You have to decide what protecting means. You have to decide what your people mean. You have to decide the meaning of every single word because it's contextual. And then you have to communicate the meaning rather than the words. We have to get into the habit of explaining what we mean rather than just using words as labels and assuming that other people are going to figure it out, because they don't. What you consider danger is not necessarily the same as what I consider danger. People who, race cars for a living or jump out of planes, what they consider danger is not what we consider danger, and so on. It's not a universal meaning. It doesn't work that way.
So, question here from Sharon. So, what are your thoughts about our business purpose in that we make your world a safer place?
Okay. Purpose. This is a bit of a popular topic at the moment, thanks to the people like Simon Sinek and so on. Here's the thing with purpose. Purpose changes. Purpose is not a constant. This is one of the biggest issues when companies create a purpose, this idea that there's one of them. If you think about something like Anzac Day, what's the purpose of Anzac Day, Jerome?
To remember our fallen from served over in Gallipoli.
That's one. What else?
A great day to get together with the family.
Yep, there's another one. It's a holiday, so we could all get together. What else?
Barbecue.
Yeah, we can see how quickly how seriously you're taking this. No, for some people, it's to remember a very specific wartime incident. For some people, it's to remember the fallen in general. For some people, it's to acknowledge people who are serving currently. For some people, it's to remember their granddad who fought in the war. For some people, it's to remember everyone. For some people, it's if you're in the Army or you're in the Navy or in the Air Force, for example, it's a recruitment day. Right? So there are lots and lots of different purposes. And where we get into into arguments and fights is when one person's purpose is seen as being, abhorrent or inappropriate compared to someone else's purpose. The interesting thing is, though, that Anzac Day thrives, right? It gets bigger and bigger every year, both in Australia and New Zealand, despite the fact it's got all these different purposes. Why? Because we all understand what it means. That's the difference. So purpose is all well and good, and purpose can be a way of focusing people, but there's no one purpose for anything. There are multiple purposes. So you have to consider, well, what are the purposes that work in our organization? And purpose will change depending on the person, depending on the job, depending on the organization, depending on the time of day sometimes. There's a variety of them. So latching on to purpose as if it's some big, be-all, end-all guiding principle, I think is wrong. It's certainly important as part of your context, but that also includes things like, what do you do, how do you behave, how do you want to be seen, what's your point of view, what's your value. All of those things come together to form an identity. And one of the problems that we have with organizations is they don't really know what they are. They don't really know what they represent because they haven't taken the time to figure that out. Yesterday, I think at the Royal Commission in Banking, Andrew Thorburn, who's the CEO of NAB, was busy saying to the Royal Commission, well, the last few years we haven't really had a purpose. Your problems are much bigger than that, Andrew. So what we're trying to get across to people is that it is very much contextual. You have to decide what these things mean. You then have to make sure that the language says what you mean. And that the only way you can do that is by testing it. And you have to understand that if someone doesn't understand what you mean by something, that's your fault, not theirs. You have to find another way of explaining it. You can't do what my father does in these situations where someone doesn't understand something that he's just said. His response is to say exactly the same thing, but much more loudly and much more slowly than before, because clearly the problem's comprehension. You have to explain it differently. So if you've got a campaign, if you've got a program that's not working, that's not getting the result, change it. Don't sit there persisting it and saying to yourselves, well, our audience just need to get smarter. No, they don't. You need to find a different way of communicating the information. And maybe you need to take a step back and figure out what it is that you were trying to communicate in the first place. Because this is the thing that we find as linguists, time and time again, is that people rush to communicate something before they truly understand what it is they're trying to communicate. You see this in brand all the time. You see it in safety as well. And we don't take the time to figure out what we really mean. And as a consequence, we have all of these systems and processes and ideas oftentimes in conflict with each other. We latch on to whatever the latest, brightest idea is and try to use that. We borrow stuff from other companies rather than sitting down and trying to develop our own. We grab things out of the ether and think, oh, let's have a go. Oh, there's a poster, that'll do. Very quickly, what we see in the world of safety is drifting into compliance. Safety is an active thing. It has to be ongoing because danger, risk, and injury are always ongoing. So the minute that you think you're done, that's when you know things are about to go wrong.
So it's always a continuous improvement journey.
Yes, yeah, and in some ways it's always a continuous definition journey. You know, what do we mean by this? Is this the best way to explain that? Is this the best way to say it? You know, so much of what we know, the lady who commented before about learning, we know an awful lot about how learning works, and we apply pretty much none of it in an organizational context or even in the education system. You know, we sit people down in classrooms to teach them stuff. We know that learning is experiential at its best. We know that for a fact. We try to teach them an entire concept all at once. We know that learning is best when it's broken down into small chunks. We know that for a fact. But we don't do any of that stuff because it takes longer and it's more expensive. And then we wonder why people aren't doing what we... Yeah, exactly. And it's because we haven't actually taught them anything.
We're ticking the box.
Yeah, exactly. And what we say to people constantly is you have to look at your core language. You have to go back and go, what does this really mean? Is this making sense? You know, would the person at the lowest level of the organization understand this? Because if they don't, why would anyone else?
I think that's a fantastic way to close out. Thank you, Brett.
That's all right. Just for the benefit of everyone, doing this work on safety with you, Jerome, and the team has been fascinating for us. It's not an area that we would generally get involved in, but we've realized that it's a Pandora's box. So we are writing a language of safety book that will be out next year.
Cool.
And anyone who wants it, you're more than welcome. It's a service from us. Please get in touch. Send me an email, whatever. We'll put you on a list and we'll make sure that gets out to you.
Great. And we'll link into it on the website. And Ian, I hope that's a bit of a resource. You shot a question saying, look, do you have any reading resources? And on Q, managed to put that up. So, and Brett's always available and easy to reach for those who want to reach out to him as well, as we have. So thank you all very much. The webinar will be available after this. And thank you very much for 2019. This is our last one for the year, and we'll begin looking at doing it ones early in the new year. So please go to our website, register for the newsletter, and stay tuned in the future. Thank you very much, Brett.
Thanks, Jerome.